Welcome to White Shadows. Tonight, I take you deep into the darkest corners of history, where the horrors of World War II still linger in the forgotten spaces. So, grab your earphones, flick on the lights, and prepare yourself, because the first tale is about to begin. The Compass of the Forgotten Keeper. Arthur had been stationed at a remote coastal post during the brutal days of World War II, where the cries of war seemed distant, muffled by the relentless waves crashing against the cliffs. It was a lonely outpost with the scent of salt and decay in the air, where his only company was a wind and the occasional patrol. The nights were the worst. Bitter winds howling through the cracks in the barracks, and the endless, oppressive darkness that felt like it would swallow him whole. One stormy evening, after a long patrol along the craggy coastline, Arthur sought refuge in the only building within miles, a decrepit lighthouse, its lantern long extinguished, its walls worn by years of neglect. As he entered, he was greeted by the sight of a frail, pale elderly man standing in the dim light. His weathered coat flapped against the howling winds, and his eyes gleamed with a strange, unsettling intensity. "You must be cold," the man croaked, his voice rough as the sea's waves. "Come in, soldier. I have something to offer you." Arthur hesitated, but then stepped forward, thankful for any warmth. The old man led him to a small, dimly lit room furnished with little more than a creaky table and some chairs. The smell of stale food hung in the air, but there was a fire crackling in the corner, and Arthur couldn't resist its comfort. The man offered him food and a steaming mug of something that smelled of herbs and salt. Arthur took it gratefully, though he couldn't shake the unease creeping up his spine. The man's presence felt wrong, as though the room itself had been trapped in time. Before Arthur could speak, the old man pushed something toward him. A brass compass, ornate and ancient-looking, its face worn smooth by years of use. "This," the man said softly, "will always guide you home." Arthur frowned, puzzled. "Guide me home?" he asked, his voice strained. "Yes," the man replied, his pale eyes gleaming in the firelight. "This compass never points north, soldier. It points to where you need to be, to where you belong." Arthur didn't understand, but he took the compass, tucking it into his coat pocket as he left the lighthouse, the storm now raging outside. He didn't think much of the old man's words that night, too exhausted from the storm and the war to dwell on them. Weeks passed. Arthur's regiment was reassigned, and soon after, the war ended. He returned home, but something about the stormy night at the lighthouse haunted him. He couldn't shake the image of the pale man with the strange eyes. Determined to thank the man for his hospitality, Arthur set out to find the lighthouse once more. When he arrived, his heart sank. The lighthouse was no longer standing. It was nothing but a crumbling ruin, its stone walls half sunken into the earth, swallowed by the weight of time and neglect. Confused and unsettled, Arthur approached a local fisherman and asked about the lighthouse. "That old thing," the fisherman grunted, spitting into the sea. "Been abandoned for years. Last keeper died a decade ago. Never knew a soul would stay out there, though he did always carry an odd-looking compass with him." Arthur's blood ran cold. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the same ornate compass, the one the old man had given him. It was the same, no doubt, but there was no explanation for it, no answer to the mystery. Though he never fully understood what had happened that stormy night, Arthur kept the compass close, believing somehow it had guided him through the darkest moments of the war. He never told anyone of the strange meeting in the lighthouse, but every so often, when he felt lost or uncertain, he'd glance at the compass, and, just for a moment, It would feel like it was guiding him towards something he couldn't quite grasp. And sometimes, just as the wind would pick up, he'd swear he could hear the distant echo of the old man's voice, murmuring in the storm. Are you scared yet? This is just the beginning. The next one will have you clutching your pillows. Here comes the next tale. The Silent Snow Cave. My grandpa was just 19 years old when he enlisted in the British Army during World War II. He expected to be sent to places like Tunisia, Italy, or the Pacific, but instead, he was stationed in a small, isolated village in the Swiss Alps. Switzerland tried its best to stay neutral during the war, but when Nazi forces began encroaching on the borders, England sent reinforcements to help protect the country. That's how my grandpa ended up stuck in a village buried under feet of snow in the middle of nowhere. It was early December 1943, and the village had about 500 people, most of them speaking German. The soldiers were cut off from the rest of the world. A series of blizzards had buried the roads, and communication lines were down. My grandpa's company was forced to live in the village, surrounded by the mountains, with only the faintest slivers of sunlight making it into the town. It felt like a place where time stood still. At first, the villagers noticed small things going missing. Pieces of wood, tarps, a few valuables. But then children began disappearing. One child went missing, then another, and another. As the snow continued to fall and the winter grew colder, the disappearances escalated. 7 children vanished over the course of a few weeks. The villagers were terrified, and some of them began demanding help from the British soldiers. One night, a distraught father burst into the local bar, shouting in broken English. His 2 children had disappeared, and despite searching the entire village, there was no trace of them. The villagers pleaded with my grandpa's captain to do something. Though the British soldiers weren't there to act as mercenaries, they agreed to patrol the village at night. But despite their efforts, the children continued to vanish. Even one of the soldiers, a man named Reginald, disappeared without a trace. It didn't make sense. There were no wild animals in the area that could account for the disappearances, and no one had seen anyone leave the village. The rumors started. Some said a monster was lurking in the mountains, preying on the children. Others suggested that the villagers themselves were hiding something, but the snow kept falling, and the days stretched on with no answers. Then one night, while on patrol, my grandpa and his comrades spotted a figure lurking outside one of the village houses. The figure looked through the window, then immediately fled into the night. The soldiers gave chase, running through the deep snow until they reached the outskirts of the village, where the figure seemed to disappear into a snowbank. When they approached the snowbank, they realized it wasn't just snow. It was a hollowed-out cave. They called out, but when no one responded, gunfire rang out from inside. Without thinking, the soldiers fired back. They waited in silence for what felt like hours, until one brave soldier crawled into the cave to investigate. He didn't come back for a long time, and when he finally emerged, his face was ashen. He was barely able to speak. Inside the cave, the soldiers discovered the horrifying truth. Reginald, the missing soldier, had gone mad. He had been abducting the children in the night, dragging them into the snow cave where he dismembered them. Some of the bodies had been partially eaten. Their remains scattered across the ice. Reginald had lost all sense of reality, and in the isolation of the mountains, he descended into madness. The horror wasn't just the war outside the village, but the nightmare that had been living within it all along. My grandpa never forgot what he saw that night, and neither will I. Wait! Don't go anywhere. The last one is left. It is called Whispers of the Bloodstained Snow. In the winter of 1944, Sergeant Jack Mitchell found himself on the front lines in Eastern Europe, a place where the biting cold was matched only by the bitterness of war. His unit had been sent to secure a small, abandoned village deep in the forest, a strategic point to cut off the enemy's supply lines. But the village, forgotten by time and war, hid secrets far darker than any soldier could imagine. The soldiers marched through the snow-covered streets of the village, their boots crunching on the frozen ground, their breath rising in clouds of vapor. The houses, empty and decaying, seemed to watch them with broken windows, hollowed eyes. A feeling of unease hung in the air like a thick fog, but Jack had grown used to it. War had a way of dulling even the sharpest senses. As they moved deeper into the village, they entered an old stone house, its door hanging off its hinges. Inside, the air was musty, thick with the smell of mold and decay. The only sound was the howling wind outside and the occasional creak of the building as it settled under the weight of the snow. Jack was in the front, moving cautiously through the darkened interior. It was then that he saw her, a woman, pale as death, standing motionless in the far corner of the room, her long black hair draped over her face, and she wore a white gown that shimmered faintly in the dim light, as if it had been soaked in something more sinister than just water. Jack froze, his heart hammering in his chest. "Who's there?" he called, his voice trembling slightly. His hand instinctively reached for his rifle, but the woman didn't move. A chill ran down his spine as he took a step forward. The temperature in the room seemed to drop even further, and a low whisper began to fill the air. The woman's lips barely moved, but the words were unmistakable. "You killed me?" Jack's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't even seen her face, but the voice, cold and accusatory, was unmistakable. His mind flashed back to the horrors of the battlefield. He had killed countless people, soldiers, civilians, women, and children. But he couldn't remember this woman. She wasn't one of the enemy. She wasn't supposed to be here. Without warning, the room seemed to distort. The walls pressed in, and the air turned thick with the scent of blood. Jack stumbled back, his legs unsteady, his mind struggling to grasp the horror unfolding before him. The woman's face twisted into something grotesque. Her skin stretched tight over her skull, her eyes wide and hollow, blood dripping from her mouth. "You killed me," she repeated, the words dragging out, growing louder, more deafening. "You killed me, and now you'll pay." Before Jack could react, a cold hand shot out from the darkness, gripping his throat with an unnatural strength. The woman's form began to fade in and out, her ghostly body shifting between the real and the unreal, her eyes burning with rage. He couldn't breathe. His vision blurred and panic flooded his chest. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and all around him, he could hear the faint whispers of countless souls, trapped in this forgotten place. He fought to tear her hand away, but it was no use. The woman's grip tightened. In his final moments, Jack realized with horror, this wasn't just the ghost of a woman he had killed. She was the embodiment of every innocent life lost in the hell of war, and she was coming for him. The next morning, when his comrades returned to the house, they found the room empty. There was no sign of Jack, only a patch of fresh blood on the floor. The walls, too, had been stained with red, as if someone had clawed at them in desperation. They never found Jack Mitchell's body, but they heard the whispers of his name carried on the wind for days afterward, just as they had heard the whispers of others. The woman's vengeance had only just begun.